Alright, I guess I am reintroducing Pod 12. I did like the first minute of this and then got sidetracked, so I'm gonna try and start again. So, last time I was discussing the character of Odysseus in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and a project I have in mind for really a quantitative and qualitative analysis kind of across the board of Odysseus as a character, with the focus of trying to gain an understanding of Odysseus as a sort of a heroic figure for what would have been contemporary Greek culture for somebody like Plato, and some of the ways in which Plato's philosophy seems to be a bit of a refutation of some of the ethic that comes out from a character such as Odysseus. And so wanted to go through Odysseus's character, and last time discussing one, I think the interesting issues for Odysseus is the question of why he wanders and veers as a character, why he has his long 20-year gnosis, that sort of open question that can be answered by anybody in a variety of different ways. And so I think it's just interesting to inform it from the perspective of looking at somebody like Plato, who essentially looked, I think, at a character like Odysseus from a certain perspective of not really approving a lot of the ethics that Odysseus sort of embodies, and then wanting to do more of an analysis to understand the character of Odysseus, both in context with his fellows, and then just considering the character as far as people using it as a role model, it being sort of a statement about Greek civilization, the way they viewed themselves as people, etc. And so I was discussing in that pod to some extent the way in which Plato really is a reformer and a bit of a revolutionary when it comes to the issue of Greek religion sort of writ large. I think you can look at a lot of the Platonic material and say that Plato, through his character of Socrates, is clearly signaling in a direction very different from the contemporary Greek culture. And what does that mean? What does that entail? And so I wanted to go through today, and I was going to do this anyway, but to go through in detail of Plato's works, to start to go through some of these ideas, start to outline what I think about them, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I have something that I wrote years ago about Plato, and so I just have it on a note sheet here, and then I guess I'm going to read some of the quotes that are on the back of this, and then we're going to get into more of a point-by-point analysis of Plato's Euthyphro. But just have something written here. A note says, Plato's dialectic form, in fact, engenders a logical understanding of issues via truth affirmation at the propositional level via an interlocutor to affirm or deny the truth of those propositions. So the con of this sort of dialectic form are, mysticism can be unclear, storytelling, subjective, leading/misleading questions and answers. And then that's sort of Seth Paskin's reading of Theaetetus. So that's just something that can come up as a sort of rejoinder to the way that Plato tends to be viewed as far as his dialectical style. But so I have here is like almost a mini presentation here, so I'll just run through these quotes. But this sort of mini presentation is called Answer the Damn Question, Plato's Euthyphro. And I'll go over more in detail of these things, but just want to highlight these quotes at the beginning to start to draw attention to them. So one quote here, so you haven't answered my question, my excellent friend. You see, I wasn't asking you what the self-same thing is that's both pious and impious. Instead, I think they deny acting unjustly, don't they? let me restart. So you haven't answered my question, my excellent friend. You see, I wasn't asking you what the self-same thing is that's both pious and impious. So that is sort of the question at hand in Euthyphro. Largely speaking, is Socrates is having a dialectic with Euthyphro in the hopes that he will have a greater understanding of piety and then be able to better defend himself at trial from charges of impiety. So another quote from Euthyphro that's really good is, instead I think they deny acting unjustly, don't they? Basically pointing out that people don't tend to act in an impious or unjust way and dispute that they're doing the wrong thing. He's basically saying that people tend to deny acting in an unjust manner because they think of themselves as acting in a just manner, whether or not that's actually true, but it's sort of a Platonic idea that nobody does evil willingly, and therefore anybody who's acting unjustly will deny that they did so on intentional grounds of essentially, I didn't mean it. That's another good quote. Another good quote, I think men and gods who argue, Euthyphro, if indeed gods really do argue instead about actions. So this is a broad discussion about the gods and what they do and do not argue about, what they like, what piety consists of, etc. So I'll get more into it, but another good quote, what evidence do you have that all the gods ... So that's going to be another point in Socrates' sort of analysis of Euthyphro is, well, what evidence do you have if you're going to tell me that the pious is what's loved by all the gods? What evidence do you have that all the gods love any particular thing, especially in a polytheistic context where clearly in their sacred scriptures, such as the Iliad and the Odyssey, the gods quarrel, they fight, Zeus says sometime in the Iliad, the rest of you supernatural beings could basically play tug of war with me, and I would beat you all because I'm the supreme power in the universe, etc. Another good quote, I guess, from this, and it's sort of a good statement of sort of the Platonic method. Come, try to give me a clear proof. And then another one, is that how you now like to define the pious and the impious? Then Socrates basically proceeds to show the inadequacy of the definitions, and then he says, I'll let you off on that point, Euthyphro, if you like. Let's suppose ... So that's sort of the style with Plato's. It is a conversation, so if the interlocutor won't exactly cooperate on a certain point, that's why Plato's works are not definitive statements of ideology. They're an embracing of a discussion, and it's not always seemingly the absolute notion of whatever Plato's opinion would have been on any issue. So another good quote here, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it's loved? So that's it's pious because God loves pious, or the other way around question. And then one final good quote before getting into it in proper. When people say such things about the gods, I find them somewhat hard to accept. We admit to ourselves that we know nothing about them. Do you really believe those stories are true? So these are some of the quotes that I'd like you to keep in mind as far as we're discussing Homer. We're discussing Plato in relation to Homer. We're discussing Plato's opinion of Odysseus. And we have here Socrates, which is sort of Plato's mouthpiece. But when it comes to Euthyphro, there's more reason to believe that this is either based on a real event, or if this particular conversation / confrontation did not occur at the Pnyx or wherever it is that Socrates is being brought to trial. No, he's at the court of the King Archon, and this whole sort of conversation goes along lines that, if you read it carefully, I think are really indicative of the ideology that will become Christianity later on. And therefore, I think there's a lot of relatively important stuff that Plato sort of introduces as ideas in Euthyphro, and I consider it kind of one of the preeminent works of philosophy that anybody could ever read. And so, just to go over this real quickly, to discuss Plato's Euthyphro, and just one thing to sort of quickly understand about Plato is just a pagination matter, and that's the fact that your copy of Plato might be on a certain page, but you can find a little bit more objective stuff based on the pagination on the sides of the pages and the margins. And so Euthyphro is up at the front of these selections, and so I think the Greek pagination, it goes 2 A B C D, 3 A B C D, etc., all the way through. And so if you're interested in looking at Euthyphro for yourself, obviously read the whole thing. It's not very long. You can figure it out. Even if you're confused, just read the whole damn thing. Don't try to read it in pieces, but then when you're going back through it, certain selected sections that I think are most relevant in this text is 3, 4C, 5C through D, 6, 7C, 8D, 10A, 11C, 13C through D, 14B through 15B. And then after that, the stuff I have written here is actually from Apology. So, just to start off real quick, we're talking about Euthyphro, and I think this is where you can really start an intro to philosophy class, is really just going over this material right here, going through the Euthyphro. It's such a great example of the Platonic method, the way it's implemented, the aporia that the interlocutors both experience, etc. So rather than reading this whole intro that's here, I'm just going to summarize myself. So Socrates is an older guy in 399 BC, 70 years old, brought to trial by a man named Miletus, charged of impiety, among other things. And so in this dialogue, he's on his way to a preliminary hearing at which he will hear Miletus's formal charges for the first time, at which the official in charge of impiety cases, the King Archon, will determine whether or not there's a case to answer. And so Socrates is being put on trial, which in context in ancient Athens, I think you could just bring a suit against somebody and then ultimately, spoiler alert, but they put Socrates to death. So the consequence of some of these trials could be exile mostly. They basically just wanted to get rid of you, but an alternative to that is killing you if you piss them off too much. So that's kind of what happened to Socrates, long story short. And it's one of the great shames of Athenian history is that this democracy voted democratically to put allegedly their best citizen to death for really just weak, badly formed reasons. And essentially what the problem is, and Socrates kind of reveals this during his trial, is they're basically trying him for being an atheist and for believing in daimonic activities, which a daimon is essentially a minor god or a divine voice. And so Socrates proves the sort of inconsistent nature of calling him an atheist while claiming that he claims that he has certain divine messaging that's given to him at certain times in certain ways. And so whether or not Socrates is using rhetoric to slightly trick people in that case, or to get them to not understand kind of the full scope of his religious views, which I think from reading Plato's work broadly, I can say that Plato through Socrates certainly does have religious views. I think there's no doubt about that. I don't think there's much reason to doubt that Plato, at least at the front of his mind, is still an explicit adherent to most aspects of Greek culture, including religion. He just quibbles with so many individual points that you wonder what his overall connection is to it. But there's too many invocations of the gods, traditional stories and all that, to think that Plato completely rejected his culture and was completely countercultural. And so, keeping that in mind, when I say that Plato's, laying the groundwork for a religion like Christianity, I'd argue he is doing that, but he's not doing that. He's not doing that explicitly trying to undermine religion. I think he has genuine questions that get prompted by the intellectual thoughts that I think are really the true priority, but so it's complicated, essentially, what Plato and or Socrates' true opinions on religions were, but just from observation of what happens during the dialogues, you can certainly say that Socrates professes himself to be a pious man of sorts, and so of what sort is he leaning in a new direction that the world will sort of take steps towards several centuries after the fact? That's speculation, but anyway, so to start off in the Euthyphro, and I'm just going to read this quote here. So, one of the things that's great about Plato as a writer is he just starts the story in the middle of the story. He doesn't give you that whole intro at the beginning. He just has Euthyphro say, "What's new, Socrates, to make you leave the Lyceum, where you usually spend your time, to spend it here today at the court of the King Archon? Surely you don't have some sort of lawsuit before the king, as I do." And then Socrates rejoinders him with, "Athenians don't call it a lawsuit, Euthyphro, but an indictment." And then, so Euthyphro is thrown off from the beginning, and from his first line, Euthyphro is immediately confused, which will be his state of being throughout most of this dialogue. But he is confused, essentially, to why Socrates is there, because again, as he says, Socrates is usually located at the Lyceum, or he's in the marketplace at the Agora. So he's usually in certain places, and then to not be in those places, marks Socrates' behavior as a little strange. And then Euthyphro, who will go over this, but Euthyphro is there because he is prosecuting somebody, and we'll get into the weird details of that. But he is there to prosecute somebody, and so kind of ironically, or tellingly, almost telling on himself, but Euthyphro asked the question to Socrates, "Surely you don't have some sort of lawsuit before the king, as I do." And so, also just real quick, to not let the term throw you off, to call it the King Archon, I'd want to know what the actual wording of King Archon, Themistotype, whatever. The term King Archon is slightly redundant, because Archon was a sort of archaic term for king before I think Basileus became more in form. So, but just to clarify, the King Archon is not the king of Athens. He's a religious figure. He's a public official and chosen by the civilians and the citizens of Athens. And there's different archons, but King Archon deals with important religious issues, homicide. The king's court, or the porch, was in the marketplace, so frankly not somewhere where Socrates is that unfamiliar with. But that notwithstanding, you've got Socrates. He essentially comes out of court, and he's already so actually no. Yeah, so I don't even think it's made clear in the wording of this, but based on my reading, it seems like he's already been indicted and he's coming out of his indictment. So he's essentially been arraigned, and but actually no. The reason why, yeah, it's unclear. He's either on his way in or on his way out. Either way, that's not the most important detail. But what is important from Socrates' first line here, so Athenians don't call it a lawsuit, Euthyphro, but an indictment. And so you can hear in the tone of Socrates' response certain characteristic things of Socrates that you will see over and over again in Plato's work. Number one, Socrates loves a pithy little response to something. He's witty. And the other thing is there's a good reason to think that Socrates spent a lot of his time not being sarcastic, but engaging in what has now been referred to as Socratic irony, where he essentially says things that have hidden meanings that essentially are meant to reveal his contempt for people, generally speaking. But this contempt is slightly bipolar. It is what people argue, is that Socrates has a lot of contempt for a lot of people, and that what he does going around questioning people is plainly attempts to undermine other people. And so here, he's aware of who Euthyphro is, and he will show that later on in their discussion. So you can see how this is a slightly sarcastic response to Euthyphro, to have somebody coming to you and saying, surely you don't have a lawsuit in front of the king as I do, and then basically Socrates gently corrects him. It's not a lawsuit but an indictment. And so that's just interesting to look at, because you can look at it one of two ways there, and you can look at it, I guess, in both of those ways at the same time. But one way of looking at it is that Socrates essentially spends most of his time basically being sarcastic or ironic, and then when he's not doing that, it's a bit of a change of pace, probably for the sake of philosophy or something. And then on the other side of it, there's the opinion that Socrates essentially may have had some sort of autism, whether it was Asperger's or something, and I'll go into reasons for why I think that much later. But long story short, what the consequence of that is for his personality is that there's a certain way he presents himself where there's a certain genuineness and authenticity to the questions that he's asking, where it may be that he has opinions on the matters that he's asking about, but when he's in this discussion with Euthyphro, I think what you'll discover is that he very much, though he has opinions, is willing to adjust his opinions, except what Socrates does not accept is logical inconsistency. Socrates wants logical consistency from point to point to point, as much as is possible, and his common sort of Socratic method for destroying XYZ person's definition of something is to run through sort of the logical consequences of the definition thus given, and then prove why one of the consequences is unacceptable. And then that's just basically an indirect proof from formal logic, where you've negated something by negating essentially the consequence of it, and then doing modus tollens more or less. And so that is sort of the way Socrates tends to go about things, and there's sort of a good reason to think that on the Socratic irony side of the argument, to think, well, Socrates is far too learned and frankly has way too many opinions for him to be so genuine in a conversation like this with somebody like Euthyphro, who you can really make the argument that his contempt for Euthyphro is showing certainly from the beginning, and in that he's essentially humoring Euthyphro and kind of wants to go on his way, but one of the things about Socrates is he just can't resist a conversation with anybody. And again, why is that the case? Is that the genuine, he likes communicating with people, he likes dialectic? Is it the liking tearing people down element to it? Not even necessary to come to a conclusion, just to sort of set that in front of you. And so after he says, Athenians don't call it a lawsuit, Euthyphro, but an indictment, Euthyphro responds, "What? Someone has indicted you, apparently, for I'm not going to accuse you of indicting somebody else." So again, the irony and the lack of of reflection from Euthyphro that he's prosecuting somebody, but of course Socrates wouldn't be doing that. And so he's essentially patronizing Socrates by saying, "You're not on my level, old man. Like, of course you're not here to do what I'm here to do, because I'm here from some serious business, and you must be here for some other reason." And then Socrates sort of rejoinders him again with, "No, I certainly haven't." And that's where you can start to see, like, well, he might not be the happiest to be talking to Euthyphro, although in a few seconds I guess he will be, because he's gonna latch on to something in particular that he's gonna chew on for the rest of the dialogue. But so Euthyphro responds, "But someone else has indicted you." Socrates, "Exactly. Euthyphro, who is he?" Socrates, "I hardly know the man myself, Euthyphro. He's young and unknown, it seems, but I believe his name's Miletus. He belongs to the Pythian deme," which is just one of the tribes in Athens. There's 12 tribes, I think. If you recall Miletus from that deme, straight hair, not much of a beard, slightly hooked nose. Euthyphro, "No, I don't recall him, Socrates, but tell me, what indictment has he brought against you?" And Socrates says, "What indictment? Not a trivial one, it seems to me. I mean, it's no small thing for a young man to come to know such an important matter. See, according to him, he knows who the young men are being corrupted and who's corrupting them. He's probably a wise man who's seen that my own ignorance is corrupting his contemporaries, coming to accuse me to their mother, the city, so to speak. In fact, he seems to be the only one who's starting up in politics correctly, for it is correct to take care of the young first, to make them best possible, just as it's reasonable for a good farmer to take care of the young plants first and all others afterward. And so Miletus, too, is presumably first weeding out those of us who corrupt the young shoots, as he claims. Then, after that, he'll clearly take care of the older people and bring about the greatest good, both in number and in quality, for the city. That, at any rate, is the likely outcome of such a start." So this paragraph right here perfectly demonstrates the two poles of this argument of Socratic irony versus this dude was just straight up like one of the more, not gullible, but went along with it, kind of credulous is the word I'd use. He believes a lot of things, and he's always trying to give people the benefit of the doubt. So that, like, there's the explicit side of what he actually says, and then the irony usually comes from the fact that he's saying something that essentially he doesn't mean. So to kind of go through this, so when Socrates says, "What indictment? Not a trivial one," so it's not a trivial charge, because he is being charged with impiety and corrupting the youth and a few other things. But when you look at those charges in themselves, I think you'd say unlikely to cause them to put Socrates to death. Essentially, the only reason they put him to death is because after convicting them, Socrates essentially taunts the jury by telling them that his punishment should be being treated like an Olympic athlete, being given food and lodging by the state for the rest of his life, sort of thing, and pisses them off, and then they vote to put him to death, which is viewed as a characteristically irrational action by a democratic polity. That, how could you all let emotion so cloud your judgment, etc. But arguably, again, Socrates does that on purpose because he wants to die as a result of his trial. That's an argument to be made, kind of on the irony side of things. And so, looking through what he's saying, he's saying not a trivial one, but on the irony side of it, you might be saying, well, he's kind of pointing to the trivial nature of the indictment by saying it's not trivial, because the next things he says certainly do sound sarcastic when he says, I mean, it's no small thing for a young man to come to know such an important matter. You see, according to him, he knows how the young men are being corrupted and who's corrupting them. He's probably a wise man. So, and I'll read to the end of that sentence. He's probably a wise man who's seen that my own ignorance is corrupting his contemporaries, and he is coming to accuse me to their mother, the city, so to speak. So this is basically Socrates saying, Miletus went crying to mommy. And so Socrates is either, this is my sort of note, and it's slightly rude because you shouldn't necessarily say this, but my note is, when crying to mom, Socrates is either autistic or very sarcastic, because what he's essentially doing is he's infantilizing the prosecution by saying that their children going to their mother, and they're basically tattling on me, and that's why you can argue that he's saying it's a trivial matter, because I think that, and this is where I think the irony is so strong in this paragraph, because in context, Socrates pretty much despises the way Athenians do politics, although you can argue that because of his participation in it, he really doesn't despise it that much. But he is essentially, you can read the Eye of Stone book, Trial of Socrates, to know Socrates was almost a Spartan sympathizer in terms of some of his politics, at least. And there's elements of things that Socrates says, and we'll get to something that he just says after that, to the mother, the city piece, because it's really important, because it's a preview of something he's going to say in Republic, and it shows that there's kind of clear through lines of ideas from beginning at least to middle in terms of Plato's written works. And so, when we have Socrates say, you see, according to him, he knows how the young men are being corrupted, he's probably a wise man. Like, we know Socrates is 70 fucking years old, and he's been doing his routine for quite a while. And, in dialogues like Meno and stuff, Socrates will just come out and say that he has, relatively little respect for the politicians. He says this in Apology too, that he went to the politicians to try and get wisdom from them and couldn't get wisdom from them. And so, when Socrates says he's probably a wise man, there's really good reason to think that Socrates does not believe that. But the other side of that is it's still consistent that Socrates is saying all this in a sort of genuine way, where I guess in the back of his mind there's something trending towards the irony side, where he's essentially not aware that he's making these ironic statements, and then that's again because of kind of the Asperger's syndrome. And I only say that because there's a lot of instances in Plato's work where they say that Socrates would essentially not have seizures, but he'd be essentially lost in thought and very hard to rouse, sort of thing. And so there's some reasons to think it may be epileptic seizures, but that, that's going to pretty much every person of importance in the ancient world, especially of religious or philosophical significance, in saying that they had some sort of epileptic sort of thing that made them speak in tongues, and that's really what made them so great, sort of thing. So you want to avoid that sort of that trope. But I think here Socrates saying he's probably a wise man, I mean, Socrates is going to wipe the floor with this man in fucking court. And if what Plato wrote, and I admit I've not read Xenophon's Apology, and I'm not going to because I'm not interested, but if Plato reported anything close to what Socrates said in his own defense, then Socrates absolutely wiped the floor with these people, and that's why it's harder to really believe that he had that level of respect. But that's, again, I think it's just impossible to ignore the possibility that Socrates may have just been one of those people who's so genuine in the things that he said and believed that he doesn't even realize how potentially ironic and this, that, and the other his statements can be, just because, again, he's so obviously intelligent, but one of his main things is his espousing of his epistemic ignorance. So he knows he doesn't know. That's a famous thing from Plato and Socrates, and so I think that's a good reason to believe that the genuine side of it is probably honestly closer to the truth, because Plato and Socrates, I think they realized their own limitations, and therefore, if Socrates was just going around loudly bloviating his opinions, it would be very different. But the open nature of the dialectic and the back and forth of it is what I think gives Plato his sort of unique flavor and makes his character of Socrates so interesting. And so again, if Socrates was, put to death by the Athenians in the way described by Plato, then, shame on them, because, this dude was clearly an asset to their society, and they frigged up by putting him to death. And I think they probably realized that almost immediately as after it happened. So that's sort of so that, again, to go back to that detail of their mother, the city, the one thing that you can cite as a direct piece of evidence for why Socrates is not being sarcastic when he says that is, in Crito, he will talk about the city being your mother or your parent, essentially, and that's why you have certain obligations to it. And so that, again, there's a through line of these ideas that are consistent across the board, and that's why you can really make the argument that that Socrates is not joking when he said, they're going to accuse me to their mother, the city. Like, that's arguably his best way of understanding sort of their behavior. And then again, I think from the slightly neurodivergent perspective, I think that Socrates simply had a hard time fitting into his society to some extent, and that the unfortunate consequence of that was them democratically choosing to put him to death, which again is a real mark against Athenian society from a historical perspective. You look at Pericles' funeral oration during the Peloponnesian War, and you get such an image of this sort of city on a hill idea, a school of Greece sort of thing, and then it's like, really? Because, and I think this is also the contrast potentially between Plato and Socrates himself, where you could say maybe Socrates was more so on the genuine side of things, and then Plato, in his presenting of him, colors it with a bit of the sort of ideas of the ironic statements, and maybe Socrates was saying more than even he realized. That's actually another good way of thinking about it. I've never quite thought about it that way before, but that makes some sense to me. So, and then again, Socrates, again, he loves logical consistency, and later on in Republic he will say things along these lines, but he says right after the mother bit, In fact, he seems to me to be the only one who's starting up in politics correctly, for it is correct to take care of the young first, to make them the best possible, just as it's reasonable for a good farmer, take care of the young plants first and all others afterward. This is a slightly different rationale than what he will come to in Republic for why you essentially banish people beyond a certain age in order to really take control of your population and to shape them in a certain way if you're constructing your ideal society on the spot, essentially. And so this is, again, sort of a consistent idea from Euthyphro to the Republic that the people who start up in politics correctly, they want to take care of the young first, and whether the rationale is slightly different, this is an idea that Socrates clearly has probably had consistently said for a while, that essentially politics starts with education, is that idea. And so, and he says, so Meletus presumably first weeding out those of us who corrupt the younger shoots, as he claims. This is, again, where, you start to see the sarcasm. Like, then after that, he'll clearly take care of the older people and bring about the greatest goods, both in number and in quality, for the city. That, at any rate, is the likely outcome of such a start. And so, again, you can view that as being slightly a sarcastic statement of saying, especially in the historical context, where part of the reason the Athenians voted to put Socrates to death is their democracy had already fallen and risen as far as the end of the Peloponnesian War was concerned. It's 399, so it's like a few years after that war ended. And so, arguably, the democracy also put Socrates to death out of a little bit of a fit of rage, honestly, for kind of how the end of the war was and their frustrations with that, and kind of taking it out on somebody that they viewed as a mentor to a lot of the people like Critias, who came in with the 30 tyrants, etc. And so, but again, here in this sentence, which I'm going to reread again, just this little section, the greatest goods both in number and quality for the city. So you have there kind of the articulation of the utilitarian sort of motto, the greatest goods both in number and quality for the city, and that this is Socrates' sort of fundamental idea, is he thinks that society should be arranged to take care of people in that way. And so again, is Socrates being sarcastic and basically saying, look at the state of our city, we just lost a war, we're having all these issues, etc. Clearly this young politician coming in prosecuting me out of nowhere, clearly he's, doing the right thing. I think you can view that as sort of a sarcastic, ironic statement from Socrates. And you can view it the other way. And maybe it's Plato getting his influence on, maybe it's Socrates himself, who knows. But then to go to the next paragraph, Euthyphro says, and this is kind of Plato, honestly, like putting his own words almost into Euthyphro's mouth. But Euthyphro says, I hope it happens, Socrates, but I'm terribly afraid the opposite may result. You see, by attempting to do an injustice to you, it seems to me he's simply starting out by wronging the city at its very hearth. Tell me, what on earth does he say that you're doing that corrupts the young? So, and there's a reference to the communal heart in the Prytaneum at the symbolic center of Athens. So, Euthyphro is basically saying that this isn't pious and it's an injustice, wronging the city at its heart. So he asks Socrates, he's like, well, I don't believe this indictment. You tell me what you think the deal is. And Socrates says, strange things, my excellent friend. At any rate, on first hearing, he says I'm an inventor of gods. And because I invent new gods and don't acknowledge the old ones, he's indicted me for the latter's sake. So he says. So, I mean, we're gonna stop right there because, Euthyphro is gonna say something that is both informative and irritating. So it's a very interesting paragraph. But Socrates is saying here, number one, he's saying that the that the indictment is, or that the things he's being accused of are strange. And I think fundamentally the reason he thinks it's strange is because one of Socrates' points again is that nobody does evil willingly. Therefore, even if he's corrupting the youth, Socrates is kind of confused as to why he would ever do that. And then again, as far as the religion sort of charges against him, he says, I'm an inventor of gods because I invent new gods, don't acknowledge the old ones. He's indicting me for the latter's sake. And, you know, somebody could obviously point out, it's like, I don't think Zeus or Apollo or whoever the fuck is really at risk here by Socrates saying that he hears from his daimon every once in a while. I mean, you even see at the beginning of the Republic, Socrates and whoever the homies are that he's hanging out with are literally coming back from a religious festival of a new friggin' god that's being paraded around, the immigrants brought in or whatever the hell it was. But the idea that, you know, this was really an issue that needed to be resolved is quite silly. And then the other side, though, is that you see in things like Aristophanes' The Clouds that Socrates was certainly portrayed as a bit of a sophist, and that one of the charges against him is sort of the religion charge. But that, again, is likely not an actual charge against him. It's a remnant of a charge against Anaxagoras, I believe, or one of the predecessor philosophers in sort of the pre-Socratic tradition that had a bit of a naturalistic sort of phenomenology, and they sort of just wrongly attribute that to Socrates because they say, philosopher, you all philosophize. So, I mean, the idea that Socrates doesn't acknowledge the old gods, that's not true. He clearly acknowledges them. He also clearly questions them, so that is where I think the reality of it comes in, that it seems like Socrates was sort of, that he was an innovator in certain sense as far as religion is concerned, and therefore when we're talking about those innovations, we have to understand that the people who indicted him, I mean, clearly from the apology you can see they're fucking confused, but on the same token, again, not to say that Socrates should have been put to death for this, but it's an indication that Socrates wasn't doing nothing. There was something that he did that provoked this. Whether or not he deserved the reaction, clearly something occurred that that put Socrates on a path that people were going to have these opinions of him. And so, you know, we'll go through this paragraph now, but Euthyphro says, I understand, Socrates, that's no doubt because you say your daimonic sign comes to you on each occasion, so he has written this indictment against you for making innovations in religious matters, and comes before the court to slander you, knowing that such things are easy to misrepresent to the majority of the people. And I have to laugh before I even say this. Why, they even mock me as if I were crazy when I speak in the assembly on religious matters and predict the future for them. And yet not one of my predictions has failed to come true, but all the same, they envy anyone like ourselves. We mustn't give them a thought, though, just meet them head on. So, just to go over a couple things. Number one, I have a star next to the line. There's no doubt because you say your daimonic sign comes to you on each occasion. To explain what that means without reading the apology, Socrates essentially has a sort of a voice that he hears every once in a while, and he interprets this as a daimonic sign. So a daimon, kind of going all the way back to Homer, is sort of an indescript god. It's not one of like the specific gods where you're interacting with Athena in a servant sort of guise and you sort of know that it's a god and sort of don't. It's much more nebulous than that, but it's clearly something that's part of the religious framework of Greek society. Socrates did not invent the concept of daimonic activities. What he sort of invents, though, is he's sort of hinting at sort of a modern sort of theory of consciousness, where what happens is essentially his daimon will appear to him on certain circumstances to tell him, hey, bud, don't do that, you know. And so one of the things Socrates makes clear is that his daimon never tells him to do anything. His daimon only tells him to not do things. So, for example, his daimon tells him he's the president of a trial of a group of military generals who are actually admirals, but long story short, they lose a battle, they leave some of their people in the water and flee, and then they're put on trial for that, and they're going to be put to death. And Socrates has all these sort of procedural objections to what's going on as far as... So Socrates doesn't even object to the idea that that those generals, you know, whether they should or should not be put to death. They haven't even gotten to that point in the trial yet. Socrates' main objection is essentially trying like 9 or 10 people together in a trial only lasting one day. More or less, that was against Athenian law. Trials were not supposed to all occur in one day. I don't think you were supposed to try people in groups like that. And so what ended up happening is the Athenians sort of broke their own rules to exercise their anger at these admirals for leaving the soldiers behind in the water, etc. And what happens, this is relevant to Socrates' sort of daimon thing, but Socrates essentially renounces the trial and no longer participates after having, at least at the beginning, been the president of the trial, just due to the conventions of when his tribe was up in terms of their lottery system to be part of the 500 for a jury. And Socrates basically wants no part in it, and sort of Pontius Pilate style washes his hands of the whole thing, basically saying, you know, whether or not these people have done what you said they're doing, you know, just in terms of a formality of due process, you've clearly denied these people due process, and therefore I don't want anything to do with that. That's one example. And another example is under the 30 Tyrants, where 2 people try to get Socrates to help them arrest somebody. Socrates doesn't participate in that. And again, it's because his daimon appears to him and tells him not to do it. So the daimon never gives Socrates explicit instructions of what to do, never pushes him forward in a positive sense, only holds him back or restrains him from things. So this is where we could see sort of a more modern theory of consciousness where, you know, Socrates essentially has just got like a better angel on his shoulder, and he's not even claiming the better angel on his shoulder tells him what to do. The angel only tells him when not to do things because they're not in accord with his character or whatever it is. So again, what Euthyphro says is, you know, no doubt because you say your daimonic sign comes to you on each occasion. So, you know, innovations in religious matters, essentially you're being slandered in front of the court because such things are easy to misrepresent to the majority of people. Why they even mock me as if I were crazy when I speak in the assembly on religious matters and predict the future for them, and yet not one of my predictions has failed to come true. Now, I mean, Socrates, he doesn't need my help to tear this motherfucker to pieces, but this is like the perfect, you know, juicy lamb chop for Socrates to bite into, as just sort of this arrogant dude who thinks he knows, especially about matters such as religion, which I think Socrates will say nobody can really know anything seriously about that, only have beliefs, frankly. And then, you know, but Plato sort of put certain ironic statements in Euthyphro's mouth, like such things are easy to misrepresent to the majority of people, coming right before, you know, I predict the future for them and not one of my predictions has failed to come true. Like, I don't know about you, but people who predict the future tend to predict it inaccurately. I mean, just in general. So, I mean, you be you if you think that Euthyphro, every prediction he made was true. I'd argue that's probably not the case. But again, that's not relevant. You know, all that's relevant is just that he's setting himself up to be somebody that Socrates will frankly enjoy having a conversation with. But at the end of the day, this is a short dialogue because Euthyphro is nowhere near intelligent enough to sort of withstand the Socratic sort of dialectic method without, frankly, getting frustrated and not being willing to see it through to the conclusion. But again, it's like they even mock me as if I was crazy. But this is the guy saying, oh, you, Socrates, you couldn't possibly have a indictment in front of the King Archon or something. So Euthyphro clearly is, a bit of an arrogant guy, thinks that he knows, has special knowledge, etc. And what's going on, though, is that he's presenting himself as somebody to Socrates who has an advanced understanding of piety. Therefore, with an advanced understanding of piety, Socrates essentially thinks that Euthyphro will be able to help him, or should be able to help him. So, just to go on to the next paragraph, Socrates, yes, my dear Euthyphro, but being mocked is presumably nothing to worry about. Athenians, it seems to me, aren't much concerned if they think someone's clever, so long as he doesn't teach his own wisdom, but if they think he's making other people wise like himself, they get angry, whether out of envy, as you say, or for some other reason. So this is sort of an interesting sort of allusion, not only to Sophocles and, or I don't know why I said Sophocles there, but, Socrates basically points out to Euthyphro, because Euthyphro is basically saying, meet them head on, they envy people like us with a mantic or a prophetic sign, don't give them a second thought. And then Socrates points out, he's like, I don't give a shit about being mocked by people, but what's something to worry about is when somebody's making other people wise like himself, and that they get angry. And this is sort of, this will be echoed later in Republic in the allegory of the cave, when the prisoner goes down into the cave and tries to share their new knowledge with the people, and then the people in the cave try to kill him because they hate that he's essentially disruptive to what they think they know, the shadows on the wall, etc. They're not interested in seeing the light that the freed prisoner has seen, and he's actually disruptive to them seeing in the shadows because he's talking about seeing the light, blah, 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 blah. And so we have here Socrates is sort of pointing out, he's basically like, being mocked is not something to be worried about. Being killed is something to potentially have a thought about, at least, something worth thinking about. And so Euthyphro says, as to that, I certainly have no desire to test their attitude towards me. And again, this is Euthyphro telling on himself because, he's, not to say he's a fraud, but, he's a fucking prophet who talks to the polity. Like, what do you think he is? So, he doesn't want to put himself in a vulnerable position. And this is another Socratic irony sort of moment, but Socrates says, don't worry, they probably think you rarely put yourself at other people's disposal and aren't willing to teach your own wisdom. But I'm afraid they think my love of people makes me tell whatever little I know unreservedly to any man, not only without charging a fee, but even glad to lose money so long as someone cares to listen to me. So as I was just saying, if they were going to mock me, as you say they do, there'd be nothing unpleasant about their spending time in the law court playing around and laughing. But if they're going to be serious, the outcome's unclear, except to you prophets. Euthyphro, well, it will probably come to nothing, Socrates, and you'll fight your case satisfactorily, as I think I'll fight mine. So this is the sort of transition to the second half of the dialogue, which is most of the dialogue, but, some points to note here. You've got Plato absolutely, I think at top form in this beginning, where there's nobody with Plato's writing style. There's nobody who feels more alive when you're reading him as a philosopher than Plato does. And, all the points that he comes to, hitting the Socratic irony thing so hard in that initial sort of long paragraph about the indictment about Miletus from Socrates, and then the statement essentially of the principle of utilitarianism, and discussing wisdom. And then, so just to go back to this paragraph here, where again we're seeing sort of Socratic irony, I think, on full display here. So I do think that Socrates fundamentally does have a bit of contempt for Euthyphro, almost from the beginning of this discussion. And part of that is he says, don't worry, they probably think that you rarely put yourself at other people's disposal and aren't willing to teach your own wisdom. So Socrates says literally, you rarely put yourself at other people's disposal. In other words, you don't serve other people at all. You serve yourself. You know, your wisdom, if you have it, is hoarded by you for yourself. And again, this is, Euthyphro has already said that he goes into the court or goes into the assembly and talks about religious matters and predicts the future. So the idea that he's not willing to teach his wisdom to people, kind of apparently not the case from Euthyphro's behavior. But then, as you'll see from the remainder of the dialogue, Euthyphro is not about that action as far as actually teaching anything. And so then again, we have sort of Socrates, stating his sort of almost his fatal flaw as a hero, if you want to think of it that way. It's, my love for the people, making me tell them whatever little I know unreservedly. Essentially, that's gonna ricochet on him in a giant way. And so then to go into the next section, but again, just keep in mind that the Socratic irony, especially in this dialogue, appears to be on a higher level, and you say it is in certain other dialogues. Like I would say in the dialogue like Phaedo, for example, I'd say there's almost no Socratic irony at all. And maybe I'll have a different opinion if I go through in detail and read it, but I really don't remember much of irony in that sense. But then here, in this conversation with Euthyphro, there's so much irony, so much going on along those lines. I think it would be hard to say that Socrates isn't, being at least somewhat sarcastic towards Euthyphro and some of the things he's saying, etc. And these things will come out, and they will be kind of fully revealed in... So let's just go to the next section here, because I already read the line about Euthyphro fighting his case satisfactorily. I'm going to pause real quick, 1 second. Pause. All right, back. A little pause there. Sorry about that. But I'm going to stop after the next... Yeah, we're not even going to go past another page here. So we're just going to go really quickly through this, because I'm going to do a second pod, which will be, I guess, pod 13 about this. But so Socrates, once he hears that Euthyphro is fighting a case, Socrates immediately seems to forget about his own situation, at least for a moment, and he says, but now, Euthyphro, what is this case of yours? Are you defending or prosecuting? Euthyphro says, prosecuting. Socrates, whom? Euthyphro, someone I'm again thought to be crazy for prosecuting. Socrates, what's that? Your prosecution, a wild goose chase? And then Euthyphro says, the goose is long past chasing. He's quite old. Socrates, who is he? Euthyphro, my father. Socrates, my good man, your own father. Euthyphro, yes indeed. Socrates, but what's the charge? What's the lawsuit about? Murder, Socrates. In the name of Heracles. Yeah, that's sort of an ironic statement from Socrates' name of Heracles, because, of course, Heracles killed his original family, yada, yada, yada. Well, Euthyphro, I suppose most people don't know how it can be correct to do this. I mean, I can't imagine any ordinary person taking that action correctly, but only someone who's already far advanced in wisdom. Yes, by Zeus, Socrates, far advanced indeed. Is this man your father killed one of your relatives, then? course he must be, mustn't he? You'd hardly be prosecuting him for murder on behalf of a stranger. So this is something to make a little bit of a note of here. In Greek society, rather than being prosecuted by the state, you were prosecuted by relatives of whoever you did something to. So if you murdered somebody, their family's coming for you, and they're going to prosecute you. So Socrates is essentially pointing out, he's like, I don't know how you could correctly take the action to prosecute your own family member. You'd have to be prosecuting him for killing a relative of yours. Otherwise, just from like the Greek cultural perspective, it's not considered proper procedure. So then Euthyphro says here, it's ridiculous, Socrates, for you to think it makes any difference whether the dead man's a stranger or relative. It's ridiculous not to see the sole consideration should be whether the killer killed justly or not. If he did, let him go. If he didn't, prosecute. If that is to say, the killer shares your own hearth and table. For the pollution's the same if you knowingly associate with such a person and don't cleanse yourself and him by bringing him to justice. So we can go over some of the points. But, Euthyphro is raising what on the surface certainly looks like a sensible argument, which is it doesn't make a difference whether a dead person's a stranger or relative, that consideration of justice shouldn't end at the family, essentially. But the interesting thing is, even though Euthyphro is really hinting towards a very interesting kind of modern idea, he's unfortunately not doing it correctly, and therefore, Socrates is going to tear this opinion to pieces, but at least Socrates will give him the sort of the grace of allowing him to explain himself. And what essentially happened is, so I'm going to sort of paraphrase through this. Victim is a day laborer of mine, farming on Naxos, worked the land for us. Day laborer got drunk, enraged one of our household slaves, cut his throat. Father tied him hand and foot, threw him in a ditch, sent a man out to find the official interpreter what should be done. In the meantime, he ignored and neglected his captive as a murderer, thinking it mattered nothing if he did die. That's just what happened. Hunger, cold, being tied up caused his death before any messenger got back from the interpreter. Precisely why my father and my other relatives are angry with me, because I'm prosecuting my father for murder on the murderer's behalf. When my father didn't even kill him, so they claim, and when even if he definitely did kill him, it's wrong, since the dead man was a murderer, to concern yourself with the victim in that case. You see, it's impious, they say, for a son to prosecute his father for murder. Little do they know, Socrates, about the gods' position on the pious and the impious. So, some things to note here. And, Socrates says, he basically puts the nail on the head when he says, but in the name of Zeus, Euthyphro, do you think that you have such exact knowledge about the positions the gods take and about the pious and the impious that in the face of these events you've no fear of acting impiously yourself and bringing your father to trial? And Euthyphro says, I'd be no use at all, Socrates, and Euthyphro would be no different from the majority of people if I didn't have exact knowledge of all such things. So I'm actually going to go from the point of what Socrates says next time, because I don't want to get too much into what Socrates says, because it's going to have bearing on the rest of the dialogue, and if I continue to do this initial podcast is going to be 3 hours long. But what's important to note here, stopping here, again, Euthyphro, what we could say about him in general is he's pretentious. So he thinks that he's right about this, that, and the other thing, especially relating to piety and justice. And Socrates essentially views that as very important in general, but also because of his particular indictment. He thinks that he needs to become Euthyphro's student so that he can then go to Miletus and convince him that he's not impious or whatever. And that's what will lead them to their discussion of piety. But what's interesting is that Socrates, in this last little bit, is very interesting. Socrates occupies a moral position that we all can't even recognize from a modern moral perspective, where his objection when he hears about a killer being prosecuted for murder is to point out the familial ties and essentially to almost retreat into the conventions of his society and what's prompting you to essentially not follow the status quo in this example. And that's where the irony versus genuineness side is, where on the one hand, Socrates could certainly be very interested in learning more about piety and seriously trying to, undermine the indictment in that sense, but he could also be doing this again because Socrates kind of enjoys pulling people's leg, and essentially he seems to love the idea of tearing down the people who think themselves wise. And so next time we go through, kind of continue going through Euthyphro and just go through the material where they discuss piety in itself, because again, I think it's just some of the best philosophy that's ever been written. And then I think that going through it, we can start to see why some of the countercultural ideas of Plato really do come through, even though there are certain times where he certainly embodies, or at least strongly states, the sort of the typical Greek cultural position on an issue. But then again, the dialectic process allows for comparison of different points of view, and that is what ultimately allows him to consider matters so broadly that you get things like, basically the definition of modern utilitarianism stated by Plato in the first page or so of his philosophy. And so next time I'll be back with more Euthyphro, but for now, that's it. So thanks.